Could Russia and Europe truly face each other on the battlefield? For years, the idea felt like a relic of history, a nightmare of the Cold War that modern integration and diplomacy had made impossible. And yet, every new crisis pulls the question closer. Skirmishes of rhetoric, sanctions that bite deeper, military drills on borders, whispers in Washington and Brussels about preparedness. The unthinkable now feels uncomfortably close to thinkable. The only uncertainty is this: if it happens, will America stand by Europe's side, or will the continent find itself alone against Moscow? The answer could determine not just who wins and who loses, but whether the very project of Europe survives. Stay with us, subscribe, because the storm that once seemed unimaginable is now the scenario that every strategist is forced to consider. At the heart of the tension is NATO, a military alliance forged to contain the Soviet Union, now pressed against Russia's borders in ways that Moscow sees as existential threats. Russia insists it cannot accept further encroachment. Europe insists it cannot abandon vulnerable allies. Between these absolutes lies confrontation. Each side builds up troops, modernizes arsenals, escalates rhetoric. Each insists it is defending itself, yet both prepare for war. Is it bluff, or is it the prelude to the largest conflict on the continent since 1945? The dilemma grows sharper when America enters the equation, or rather, when it may not. Washington has been Europe's protector for decades, underwriting its security with bases, weapons, and nuclear guarantees. But America is distracted, divided, pulled toward Asia, and consumed by its own political fractures. Can Europe truly count on Washington to commit its full weight in a war with Russia? What if America hesitates, delays, or withdraws altogether? Suddenly, the balance changes. With America, Europe is a fortress of allies. Without it, Europe is fragmented, underprepared, vulnerable. Russia watches carefully. For Moscow, the calculation is not simply about tanks and missiles. It is about time, endurance, perception. Can Russia outlast European unity, betting that America's attention will falter and Europe's resolve will fracture? Or will a decisive strike shatter illusions and force Europe to its knees before Washington even has time to act? History suggests Russia understands the power of attrition, of bleeding an enemy slowly until its politics collapse from within. Does Europe have the patience, the cohesion, the will to endure such a trial? The specter of nuclear weapons hovers over every calculation. Russia openly brandishes its arsenal as the ultimate deterrent, warning Europe that escalation would bring catastrophic consequences. Europe, under NATO's nuclear umbrella, counts on American guarantees. But guarantees are words until they are tested. Would Washington risk New York or Chicago to save Warsaw or Berlin? Would Paris or London step forward with their own arsenals if America hesitates? These are the questions whispered in ministries, never spoken aloud in public, yet they define the entire balance of deterrence. Beyond the military lies the economic battlefield. A Russia-Europe war would not remain confined to soldiers and missiles. Energy flows would halt, markets would convulse, industries would collapse. Europe, already fragile after years of energy crises and inflation, would face shortages and blackouts. Russia, reliant on resource exports, would tighten its ties to Asia, but bleed revenues in the process. The global economy, built on the assumption of stability in Europe, would spiral into chaos. The price of war would be measured in billions burned daily. Who can pay longer? Who can endure more pain? And then there is the human factor. Europe is prosperous, but its societies are unaccustomed to mass mobilization, to sacrifice, to war as a way of life. Russia is poorer but hardened, accustomed to hardship, ruled by a system that demands obedience. Which system breaks first? Which public revolts? And which accepts the cost? This is not only a contest of armies, it is a contest of resilience. The nightmare is no longer abstract. It is visible in the movements of troops, in the stockpiles of missiles, in the speeches that grow harsher each month. It is debated in parliaments, analyzed in markets, whispered in homes. Could Russia and Europe go to war? The honest answer is yes. The harder question is what happens when they do, with America or without it. And that is where we must go next. Europe on paper is powerful. The combined GDP of the European Union and the United Kingdom dwarfs Russia's economy many times over. Its industries, its technology, its educated workforce, all suggest a continent capable of overwhelming any adversary through sheer weight of resources. But war is not fought on spreadsheets. It is fought on readiness, on cohesion, on the willingness to sacrifice. And here, Europe's advantages dissolve into contradictions. Militarily, Europe is fragmented. France has nuclear weapons but struggles to project conventional power. Germany, once the economic engine of Europe, dismantled much of its military after the Cold War and has only recently begun rebuilding. The Baltic states and Poland shout the loudest about the Russian threat, but their forces are small and heavily dependent on NATO reinforcements. Italy and Spain are distracted, Britain is divided, Scandinavia is capable, but limited. Add them together, and the total is impressive. Keep them separate, and they are a patchwork of incompatible systems, doctrines, and political priorities. In war, patchworks tear easily. Europe depends on America not only for nuclear deterrence but for logistics, intelligence, and high-end weaponry. Satellites, strategic airlift, missile defense, command and control systems. Much of this comes from Washington. Without it, Europe is exposed. Even ammunition stockpiles are insufficient. The war in Ukraine has shown how quickly Europe's arsenals run dry. Factories cannot yet keep pace with demand, and building a wartime economy requires political will that many European societies no longer possess. Economically, Europe is both strong and vulnerable. Strong because it has wealth, industry, infrastructure. Vulnerable because it is addicted to stability. War would rip through its energy networks, already strained since the loss of Russian gas. Blackouts, rationing, and factory closures would follow. Inflation would surge, governments would be forced into emergency spending, debts would skyrocket. Populations that tolerated sacrifices for sanctions would balk at sacrifices for survival. Democracies are resilient, but they are also impatient. How long before voters demand an end, even if the end means concessions? Socially, Europe faces another weakness: fatigue. Years of crises, financial collapse, migration, pandemics, inflation, have eroded public trust in institutions. Protest movements simmer in France, Germany, Italy, the Netherlands. Populist parties surge at the polls, promising peace through accommodation or strength through escalation. Unity in Brussels is fragile even in peacetime. In war, it could shatter overnight. Would Hungary fight for Estonia? Would Spain fight for Poland? Would Italy bleed for Lithuania? The treaties say yes. History suggests otherwise. And yet Europe has strengths too. Its economies, though fragile, are deep. Its technology base is advanced. Its alliances, though strained, are wide. If Europe could mobilize with cohesion, it could outproduce and outspend Russia many times over. But that "if" is enormous. The question is not whether Europe has the resources, but whether it has the will, the unity, and the leadership to use them. Leadership is perhaps the greatest vulnerability. Brussels speaks the language of compromise, not command. National leaders look inward, balancing fragile coalitions and domestic unrest. Few have the authority to rally populations to sacrifice. Fewer still can inspire a vision that justifies war beyond survival. Without America to anchor and direct, Europe risks paralysis. A giant of wealth and potential, unable to act with speed or purpose. This is the paradox. Europe is both stronger and weaker than it looks. Stronger in aggregate resources, weaker in political cohesion. Stronger in values, weaker in resolve. Stronger in peace, weaker in war. And in a conflict with Russia, paradox is not enough. Only clarity wins wars. If war comes, Europe must decide whether it is truly prepared to fight for itself or whether it will always depend on the American shield. Because without that shield, the continent's impressive numbers may prove to be a mirage, and Russia knows it. To understand the possibility of war between Russia and Europe, one must look closely at Moscow's position, its strengths, its weaknesses, and the paradoxes that define its survival. Russia is both fragile and formidable. It has suffered enormous losses in Ukraine, yet it continues to fight. It has faced the heaviest sanctions regime in modern history, yet its economy endures. It has fewer allies, but it has the raw resources and strategic depth that Europe cannot easily match. The question is not whether Russia can fight, but how long it can sustain a war against the entire European continent. Militarily, Russia retains the largest arsenal of nuclear weapons on Earth. This alone forces Europe into caution. Every scenario of escalation is haunted by the possibility of Armageddon. But even below the nuclear threshold, Russia has demonstrated a brutal resilience. Its army, once dismissed as outdated, has adapted under pressure. Factories work around the clock, churning out tanks, drones, artillery shells. Casualties are high, but conscription continues, fueled by a society where dissent is muted and sacrifice is expected. In sheer manpower and willingness to absorb losses, Russia holds an advantage over Europe's cautious democracies. Geography is another weapon. Russia's vast territory provides depth, room to retreat and regroup, natural defenses that no invader has overcome lightly. Its winters, its distances, its logistics are as much an ally as its soldiers. Europe is compact, dependent on dense infrastructure that can be easily disrupted. Russia can strike deep into European territory with missiles. Europe cannot strike Moscow without American cover. The asymmetry is glaring. Economically, Russia should be weak. Its GDP is smaller than Italy's, its industries narrow, its dependence on raw exports glaring. And yet war reveals different measures of strength. Russia possesses what Europe desperately needs: energy, food, raw materials. Oil and gas continue to flow eastward, bringing in revenue. Grain and fertilizer secure goodwill in Africa and Asia. Even under sanctions, Russia has reoriented trade toward China, India, and the global south. Europe bleeds cash, importing expensive energy. Russia bleeds slower, buffered by resource wealth. Still, Russia is not invincible. Its economy is under immense strain. Technology imports are restricted. Industries are hollowed out by sanctions. Living standards decline. The state absorbs the shock through repression and propaganda. But how long can that last? Demographics are a ticking time bomb. A shrinking, aging population cannot fight endless wars. Corruption and inefficiency gnaw at the foundations of power. Russia can endure, but endurance is not the same as prosperity. Politically, the Kremlin maintains tight control. Opposition is fragmented, silenced, or exiled. The war is framed as existential, a battle not just for territory, but for Russia's survival against the West. This narrative resonates, binding society to the state. But beneath the surface, discontent simmers. A long, grinding war could erode loyalty, especially if economic hardship deepens and victories remain elusive. Regimes that appear solid often collapse suddenly when cracks spread too far. Diplomatically, Russia has isolation and influence in equal measure. It is cut off from the West, but welcomed in Beijing, Delhi, Tehran, and many capitals of the global south. For many nations weary of Western dominance, Moscow represents a counterweight, however imperfect. This support is not limitless, but it gives Russia breathing space. Europe, meanwhile, finds itself increasingly isolated from the rest of the world, portrayed as a subordinate of Washington rather than an independent pole. So who is stronger, Russia or Europe? The answer depends on time. In the short term, Russia holds advantages: geography, resources, societal endurance, military readiness. In the long term, Europe's wealth, technology, and population could overwhelm it, but only if Europe can mobilize with unity and determination. That is the critical uncertainty. Russia bets that Europe cannot, that democracies will fracture, that economies will falter, that publics will rebel. It is a bet grounded in history, and in many ways, it is Russia's only path to victory, because while Moscow can fight, it cannot indefinitely outspend or outproduce an entire continent. Its strategy, then, is not to defeat Europe outright, but to break its will before America can intervene decisively. This is Russia's position, not unassailable, but dangerous. A wounded power, cornered yet resilient, rich in resources yet poor in allies, fragile in economy yet formidable in war. To underestimate it is folly. To overestimate it is equally dangerous. The truth lies in the tension between endurance and collapse. When imagining a war between Russia and Europe, everything turns on one variable: America. With the United States fully committed, Europe becomes a fortress of wealth, technology, and military power. Without it, Europe is fractured, exposed, and uncertain. The difference is not measured only in tanks or aircraft, but in psychology, in confidence, in the belief that survival is possible. So what happens in each scenario? With America, Europe holds the advantage. U.S. satellites guide precision strikes, fleets cross the Atlantic, bases in Germany, Italy, and Poland become launch pads for NATO power. American factories pour out weapons and ammunition, replenishing Europe's thin stockpiles. The nuclear umbrella becomes a shield that Russia dares not breach. Economically, Washington underwrites the war effort with trillions in support, while its financial system squeezes Moscow further. For Russia, the fight becomes a contest not against Europe alone, but against the full weight of the West. It is a contest it cannot win conventionally, though it can prolong it through attrition and chaos. But with America comes escalation. Moscow, faced with overwhelming force, could lean harder on asymmetric tools: cyber attacks, sabotage, disruption of pipelines and cables, nuclear threats. The risk of confrontation climbing beyond control grows sharper with every American reinforcement. Europe might survive under Washington's shield, but it would do so on the edge of catastrophe. never certain that one misstep would not bring nuclear fire. Without America, the picture changes drastically. Europe musters armies, but coordination falters. Ammunition runs out faster than it can be replaced. Command structures clash between Paris, Berlin, Warsaw, London. Nuclear deterrence becomes ambiguous. France and Britain hold their arsenals, but would they risk them for the Baltics? Would they risk them for each other? Russia would test those questions relentlessly, probing for weakness, daring Europe to act. In such a scenario, Moscow would not need to conquer all of Europe. It would need only to fracture it. A strike here, a seizure there, pressure on energy supplies, cyber attacks on infrastructure. Each move designed not for total victory, but to break unity. Hungary might refuse to fight. Italy might push for peace. Germany, reliant on fragile energy supplies, might hesitate. Poland and the Baltics would demand escalation, but without America, who answers their call? Europe could collapse politically long before it collapses militarily. Who wins in such a war? In truth, no one. With America, Europe survives, but at a staggering cost. Economies shattered, cities scarred, populations traumatized. Russia, bled and isolated, may endure, but its long-term decline would accelerate. Without America, Russia may gain territory or concessions, but it too would bleed. Sanctions, losses, instability at home. Europe, left to its own devices, could face fragmentation, with the EU and NATO breaking under pressure. Victory would be Pyrrhic for all. The greatest loser might be globalization itself. Energy markets would convulse, trade routes would be severed, industries would collapse. Refugee flows in the tens of millions would destabilize politics across the continent and beyond. The very idea of an integrated global economy, already under strain, would collapse under the weight of war in Europe. This is the nightmare. With America, escalation toward catastrophe. Without America, fragmentation toward collapse. Russia cannot truly win. Europe cannot truly win. America risks being pulled into Armageddon. And yet the possibility lingers, haunting every strategy session, every market forecast, every political speech. Because war is not always about winning. Sometimes it is about survival. And sometimes it begins not because leaders want it, but because they miscalculate. Because they believe the other side will blink. Because they forget how quickly history consumes illusions.